Welcome to the Europe Direct Blanchardstown podcast. This is the next podcast in our series on mental health, and this is linked to the EU strategy on mental health. We've already recorded a few of these now on various topics, including the therapeutic process, which was our last one. And today we're going to get a bit specific, and we're going to speak about mental health for people who are neurodivergent, and in particular, this time for people with ADHD. And once again, I'm delighted to be joined by psychotherapist Amber Roche. Amber, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks for inviting me again today to speak. I'm really looking forward to talking about this topic.
Yeah, this is, and we'll get into this a bit later, but I know this is a very important topic for you, and I think a lot of people who come to obviously the Europe Direct Centres in Blanchardstown Library, we have lots of people coming, many of whom I'm sure have ADHD and would be very interested in what we have to say here. So this is all about kind of specific mental health for people with ADHD. So let's get started. I mentioned the term neurodivergent a minute ago. What does that mean exactly?
Okay, so I guess we're hearing that term bounced around a lot at the moment. But the term neurodivergence, it's an umbrella term for a number of conditions.
Okay.
And autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and ADHD, which stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
Right.
They all sit under that term.
Right. Okay, so it's a wide term for those various conditions that you've just described.
Yeah, and people who are neurodivergent, they have a brain that functions a little bit differently from what's considered typical.
Okay.
The differences, they're often seen in a person's thinking processes, their attention, the memory, also their sensory experiences.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's natural differences in the way people learn and communicate, and most children's brains, they develop in ways that are seen as typical for their age and stage.
Right.
And those children are described as neurotypical.
Right. Okay. And there's a number of kind of patterns of traits, I suppose, that you would notice with that. And I mean, we're going to focus now for a moment maybe on ADHD specifically. And the idea is we'll maybe speak about autism in a separate podcast. So today we're going to look at ADHD. And before I get into the kind of stuff about some of the traits of that, can I just ask you to tell me a little about your own personal and professional experience of ADHD?
Yes. So, Barry, I was diagnosed with ADHD coming close to 3 years. So I guess how I really found out was I had suspicions, and I guess I did a lot of interest in the area. And we're hearing the word ADHD a lot now at the moment. So some of the symptoms that I read about, I could really relate to.
Mm-hmm.
And I then went through the process of diagnosis, which involved me being referred to a psychiatrist.
Yes.
Who carried out a series of screenings and interviews that looked at some of the traits and behaviors that I exhibited. And I guess if we look at how I presented as a child, typically all my school reports would say things like she's no focus, finds it very difficult to concentrate, things like she's away with the fairies, that kind of stuff.
Oh dear.
And yeah, and that would have had a knock-on effect on my self-esteem growing up, and also anxiety.
Yeah.
I was always forgetting something or leaving things behind. And that gets even more difficult as adolescence approaches.
Yeah.
And particularly, there's a lot of research being done now around what's called PMDD, which is premenstrual dysmorphia.
Right.
which is something that is closely linked, or women with ADHD,
Mm.
they often have that experience. So it would be typically a very severe form of premenstrual tension.
Mm.
So hormones really affect people with ADHD,
Okay.
particularly around dopamine levels.
Right. Uh,
Studies have shown that estrogen can affect the production of dopamine.
okay. And it's interesting that you talk, because it seems to be something that's more associated with boys often, isn't it? And there's
Yes.
probably a lot of girls in particular who are not being diagnosed, or it's not being caught.
Yeah, that's true. We often have the image in our heads of the hyperactive active boy climbing the walls,
Mm.
not being able to sit still in the classroom, that kind of thing. The naughty boy
Yeah.
type character. But
Yeah.
in girls, what happens is they will often mask their
Mm.
symptoms. So they're typically good at disguising the symptoms.
Okay.
Therefore, they kind of go under the radar a lot. But as we're learning more about ADHD, typically more women are coming forward for diagnosis and are
Okay.
receiving treatment for it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, and it's something. I suppose, I mean, many years ago, I mean, it was terrible, really. Children were just often saying, "Oh, well, he's just naughty, or she just doesn't pay attention," or there was a genuine issue going on there, and it just wasn't kind of seen as. And I imagine a lot of children and adults, indeed, probably suffered over the years from that being undiagnosed, and just being treated as being, oh, a problem child.
Yeah, and there is a lot of stigma that comes with it.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember myself then as I progressed through adolescence, and again the symptoms tended tended to get worse then.
Mm.
And there would be things that I found it really difficult to concentrate in school.
Yeah,
And often I was quite forgetful. I would forget important dates. Time management was a real issue for me.
yeah.
I just could never get myself to things on time, or
Mm.
so I was always ending up late and
Yeah,
getting into trouble in school, which again really impacted my own anxiety
yeah,
levels.
yeah.
And then um, stuff like I've turned up at airports a day early,
Oh,
or
right. Yeah,
missed
yeah,
flights, things like that.
yeah.
Um, going to on holiday and realizing the passports were out of date, stuff like
Okay.
that.
And I'd say what you were describing there, a lot of people listening who have ADHD will identify with that. Have gone through very similar
Yes.
symptoms, or
Yeah.
similar traits. So let's kind of continue on from that. So what actually are some of the traits, or symptoms that are associated with ADHD? We've kind of touched on them already, but let's go into a bit more detail, maybe.
So the condition's characterized by a consistent pattern of developmentally inappropriate levels of three things. So
Okay.
that would be inattention,
Right.
impulsivity, and hyperactivity. So these characteristics, they often interfere with functions or development, and commonly present as difficulty sitting still, paying attention, or controlling impulsive behaviors.
Okay, okay, and again, and this is the thing where I think a lot of people, myself included, have maybe misunderstood what ADHD is. And again, you have the image of the hyperactive or the inattentive child in class, and usually a boy in your head, and that's it. But there's a lot more to it than that. So you spoke about inattention, impulsivity, which was maybe a surprise to me, and the hyperactivity. So can we maybe go into those in a little bit more detail? We start with inattention.
Yes,
Um,
so typically inattention manifests behaviorally, and we can maybe see that as a person wandering off task,
yeah,
lacking persistence, having difficulty sustaining focus, or
mm,
being disorganized.
yeah,
Other symptoms can include making careless mistakes,
Yeah.
not following through on instructions or failing to complete tasks,
Okay.
losing things, being reluctant to engage in tasks that
Right.
require sustained mental effort.
So kind of finding it hard to just get started on the task. Never mind
Yes,
finish it. Yeah.
finish it. For me, often, if I go to clean an area in the house, we all have that drawer
Yep.
the dumping drawer where everything
Yeah.
gets piled into, and I might decide one day to clean that, and I'll find something in that will lead me to another thing. So I might find a CD, and then it'll remind me of somebody, and I'll go then to look for their address, and then I'll go and send them an email, and I'm just completely going off task. And
Sidetracked.
the
Yeah.
drawer remains like a heap.
Yeah.
So it's
Suddenly,
stuff like
yeah.
that.
So it's interesting. Like somebody told me once that when they're trying to do a task, a friend who has ADHD said it's like suddenly everything else becomes more interesting than the task at hand.
Oh yeah, anything sparkly and more interesting,
Yeah.
your attention will go to that. You can
Yeah.
get bored very easily.
Right.
Mm.
Okay. Okay.
So then we look at the hyperactivity, and
Right.
that refers to excessive motor activity at inappropriate
And
times.
just can you
So
define motor activity there?
yeah, so that you could see that as somebody fidgeting
Okay.
excessively, tapping, talkativeness,
Yeah.
and the impulsivity, that would refer to hasty actions that occur in the moment, and there's no forethought, and they could potentially be risky or harmful to the person.
Okay.
So if we look back at that hyperactivity, you may see the person squirming around in their chair a lot, leaving a seated position in situations where remaining in the seats to be expected.
Okay. Okay.
And in children, we can see it as running or climbing in situations where it's inappropriate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for adults and adolescents, it can present as restlessness.
Right. Okay.
Mm.
Okay. And yeah, I mean, I suppose when you think about that often with the traits, I think people often say, "Oh, sure, I do that all the time and all that," and we all probably do possess some of the traits. It's when I suppose so many of the traits are presenting together that
Well,
maybe,
that's it. Yeah.
yeah,
So what would typically happen when somebody is screened for ADHD is that the diagnosis would fall into those three. There's three subtypes.
right,
So ADHD can be considered mild, moderate, or severe, and that depends on the number of symptoms and the
right,
extent of functional, social, or occupational impairment.
okay,
So typically we'd look at the different traits.
right,
And we have three types of ADHD.
okay, and what are they?
Yeah, so we've got primarily inattentive,
Right,
primarily hyperactive impulsive,
hmm,
or there's the combined type.
right, and which would be the most common of those?
Oh gosh, they just all kind of go together. There's no
Right,
really, typically I suppose it would be the inattentive type.
right, okay,
Um, yeah, and then there is the combined type. I would class myself as the combined type.
okay, okay, right, and just there's something quite interesting there. I've come across this term that some of these issues can affect executive functioning. What, first of all,
Yes.
what does that mean, executive functioning?
Executive functioning is what's responsible for controlling our thoughts,
Okay,
behaviors, and emotions. Executive functioning skills, they help a person with planning and organizing their time and regulating their emotions and actions.
right,
These are skills, they're necessary for prioritizing tasks, remembering details, paying attention, focusing, and self-censoring. So that
oh,
would mean avoiding saying or doing the wrong things when necessary.
yeah, Yeah.
So your executive functioning, it also helps a person understand how the things they say and do now have future consequences
Right.
for better or worse.
Right. So is this, and isn't there like a part of the brain that does this? It's kind of the impulse control part of the brain, isn't it? That kind of stops you, you know.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And people with ADHD tend to have poor executive functioning.
Okay. Yeah. So
My own son, he also has ADHD and
right.
autism. Um, but there would be a lot of very funny incidents that
Mm,
would happen where it's like he just doesn't have a filter.
right.
So he'll
Okay.
tend to blurt out things or kind of do inappropriate things.
Maybe be a
One
little
of
overly honest sometimes, maybe. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. That could sometimes be embarrassing, particularly when he was a child. He would
Mm,
blurt out things about people's appearance without
okay.
thinking.
Okay.
And they're things that he had to learn,
Yes.
those
Okay.
social nuances, what's acceptable to say in public and what's not.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's tough going to, because like, for a lot of people that comes to naturally. But I mean, if you have to learn that really and be conscious of it, that must be quite draining, I'd say.
Yes, yes, of course. And the signs and symptoms of executive dysfunction,
Yeah.
they vary among people.
Okay.
So the symptoms also can change over time.
Okay.
Yeah, so when a child with ADHD grows into adulthood, children and adults' executive dysfunction, it can look like difficulties organizing school or work
Okay.
materials,
Right.
struggles with regulating emotions. So
Mm.
there may be outbursts,
Yeah.
trouble with setting schedules, or challenges following through with simple tasks. I remember myself, I had a lot of difficulty with organizing things for school, and that would be like my school bags, stuff like that.
Right.
And I know now with my own son, I could see so many of the traits in him that I displayed as a child. And one of them typically would be, the squash banana being at the end of the bag for months on
Yeah.
end.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I've done
And
that myself. Yeah.
yes, it comes to kind of the end of the term, and I'm going through his bag, and it's just complete chaos. Nothing is ever
Yeah.
organized in the
Yeah.
morning.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And
it's literally having to do out a visual schedule for him that he can see exactly what he has to do.
yeah.
Or
So,
we will do things like we'll have just like baskets or boxes that we'll put things in, everything that he needs for the morning in
yeah.
one box. So and I do the same for myself. I'll
Yeah.
have a box as well that I'll put my bag into, or another box will have my, gym gear, things like
Mm,
that. So I have to be very organized about my
okay.
own life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, it would just be chaos.
Yeah. And like when we talk about, so as it's termed, executive dysfunction and ADHD, I mean, there's a big kind of overlap there, isn't there, in symptoms
Yes, there
between the
is. So,
two? And what would they
yeah.
be? We've kind of touched on these already, but just remind me.
So the difficulties and the overlap would be in paying attention.
Yeah.
There can be some self-control
Okay.
issues, your working memory, so the ability to memorize and use and apply information,
Right.
the difficulty switching from tasks.
Okay.
So some children may have a lot of difficulty moving from one task to the other.
Mm,
Again, focusing, so you can see a lot of daydreaming, staring outside the window,
mm.
um, completing long-term projects. There
Yeah.
might be lots of projects started and
Yeah.
unfinished.
Okay. Okay. And people often with ADHD will often nearly have an abundance of ideas for projects and can, oh, I'm
Oh,
going to do
yes.
this, I'm going to do that. And it can be overwhelming sometimes, maybe. And you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, often there can be a hyper focus.
Yeah.
So they may get an extreme interest in a certain subject. My son's one went from cars to World War II to lots of different things. He'd hyper focus and he'd want to know everything about one particular subject intensely, and then all of a sudden will lose interest.
Okay.
Myself, again, I will often decide I'm really invested in a certain hobby,
Right.
and then within a week I'll have lost interest.
You've dropped
so like
it again.
I have I've got the kombucha starter kits in the garage. I've got bread machines, things like that, and I will hyper focus and fixate on making bread. That was my last one.
Right.
And sure, the bread machine is stuck under a press, and the bags of the specialized flour are sitting in the press.
Right. Yeah.
That would be typically something that would happen with me.
Just earlier there, Amber, you mentioned the word dopamine. What is that exactly, and what's its role with ADHD?
So people with ADHD, they have a disruption in the dopamine reward pathway in their brain. So essentially, they have fewer proteins to transport dopamine to the parts of the brain responsible for executive function and motivation.
Okay, so what we spoke about earlier, the executive function.
Yes, it has a direct link.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, stimulant medications, they're often used to address the disruption in the brain. So stimulant medications would fall into the category of Ritalin, Vyvanse, dexamphetamine.
Okay, and these can help regulate.
They can, yes, they increase the production of dopamine in the brain, which then essentially helps the person focus and have motivation. Right. So not everybody likes taking medication, so you can look at treatment from a multifaceted way. But dopamine, it's often people with ADHD will chase out dopamine.
Right.
It also it can give us that kind of pleasure, that sense of euphoria of what we like.
Yes.
So because we're deficit in it, we can seek out activities, highly stimulating activities, or addictions are quite prominent in the ADHD community.
Right.
So some people can self-medicate with alcohol or drugs, but there's that kind of pleasure seeking.
Yeah. Gambling, would that be something that could be common?
Yeah, gambling as well, looking for highs, anything that will give that rush.
Or kind of thrill-seeking activities as well.
Thrill-seeking activities, and that can lead to the impulsivity and the dangerous activities as well.
Right.
So, taking risks, engaging in risky behavior, and that can be engaging in risky sexual behavior.
Right.
As I said, addictions, alcohol, drugs, that kind of thing, just chasing the hit.
So I suppose we've kind of wandered into the area now of some of the difficulties faced by people with ADHD. So maybe we'll stay with that. So I mean, the podcast series is on mental health. So let's have a look at what are some of the specific mental health issues that would be faced by people who have ADHD. And we've kind of touched on some of them just there, but let's kind of drill down a bit more on that one.
Yeah, there's a lot of coexisting conditions with ADHD, particularly anxiety and depression. And unfortunately, some people, they're treated for the presenting problem and the ADHD is overlooked.
Right.
And when the ADHD is not recognized or not treated, it can lead to self-medication with substances such as alcohol or drugs. And then that leads into other difficulties such as addictions.
Okay.
And then there's the stigma, the negative stigma that's associated with the symptoms. And that can be from an early age. being labeled messy, disorganized, lazy. There's some of the things I remember being
Yeah.
called, particularly messy, disorganized. And today that still really triggers me quite a lot.
Yeah.
And that's just part of the ADHD. It doesn't mean I'm dirty or
Yeah.
not a good person, but
Mm.
typically I'd have a lot of clutter around me, but
Mm.
I know where everything is,
Yes.
but someone else couldn't find it. It's my organized
Mm.
chaos, if you
And
know what I mean.
it's interesting because one of the big uh, kind of points of the EU mental health strategy was kind of combating stigma around mental health issues, and and even going beyond ADHD and that. I mean, that stigma around depression or anxiety, and that although it's getting a lot better and people are really much better at speaking about things. And I think one thing that's helped is we've had a lot of kind of sports personalities and that coming out and speaking about
Yes.
the issues. And even recently, and we might touch on this in the next podcast, we had the Irish footballer James McLean, who just earned 100 caps for Ireland, and a few weeks ago announced that he had autism.
Oh,
um
wow.
and as far as I know, that's the first kind of professional footballer who has ever said that. And he did an interview actually on the first new Late Late Show with Patrick Healty, and he was excellent. He gave a great description, and again, of some of the difficulties he faced. You go out in front of 60,000 people. It's, daunting anyway.
Yes,
Extra daunting for him, as he said.
absolutely. All that noise and chaos, and a lot of people with autism will also have a sensory disorder as well.
Mm.
So they can be very overwhelmed by intense noise or light, too much going on.
And can
I
I ask?
myself,
Yeah.
I hate a lot of noise. I really dislike being in an environment where there's a lot of noise going on.
Well, you've just touched on what I was going to ask you there, because there is a bit of an overlap with some of the traits with ADHD and autism. I know that, and
There are, yes.
one can be in that sensory area. That the kind of sensory overload can be difficult. Could you just talk about that for a moment?
Yes. So there's a lot of comorbidity between ADHD and autism. Again, I'll just, from my own personal experience, my son has both. And I guess I noticed from a very early age, he had a lot of difficulties with sensory processing. So he
Okay.
would become really overwhelmed with too much stimuli going on. So we go into maybe the shopping center or something, and the noise and the lights, he absolutely hated it. And
Right.
this is before he had the diagnosis. So, he would have been only maybe two or three. And it was painful for him to go into a shopping center. He'd scream the place down.
Right.
I just couldn't bring him into it. And often you'll see, have you ever seen the poor parent in, Duns or Tesco, and
Yes.
they've got
Yeah.
the child absolutely having a meltdown.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what I say is just don't judge them.
Oh no.
You don't
Yeah.
know what's going on. The kid could have undiagnosed ASD, and they just can't cope with all that stimuli. Not
Yeah.
saying that every kid that has a tantrum like, or a meltdown has, but just to be aware. And
As you say,
be
you
a
just
little
don't
bit,
know. You don't know what's going
yeah,
on in people's
uh,
lives, and we see it at the library all the time. We have a junior section, and it's tough going. I'm a parent, and I've been in that situation. It's not easy. So yeah, I think what you said there about not judging, I think is very important.
and
Yeah.
another thing, Barry, is the hyperactivity can also present as obsessive thoughts,
Okay.
so or OCD behaviors as
Mm,
well.
mm,
So a person may experience a lot of thoughts about the same thing. So their focus might be fixated on
mm.
something in particular, and that thought becomes obsessive. So they play over a certain thought over and over again in their mind, which then in turn can create a lot of anxiety. And it's being able to just recognize that and to assist people in stepping away from those thoughts and being able to engage or to break that cycle of thoughts. But that can be quite draining on
Yeah.
a person.
I would imagine, it can be quite tiring, I would say. And
Yeah,
what
very
happens
tiring.
with somebody with ADHD when they get tired? Is there anything that kind of, would that trigger anything?
Yes, they can go into what's called ADHD paralysis.
Right,
And it's really common for people with ADHD to become overwhelmed physically, mentally,
right.
and emotionally.
Mm,
So the ADHD paralysis happens when the person, they're overwhelmed by their environment or the amount of information they're receiving. And
okay,
as a result, they freeze. They're not able to think or function effectively. And that makes it really challenging for the individual to focus and complete their tasks,
right,
including urgent ones.
right.
I remember in school, I had a lot of difficulty with maths.
Mm,
But again, dyscalculia is something that people with ADHD will often experience. And the amount of information for me to process was just too much. I would just shut down in class, go asleep sometimes. And I remember being kind of the butt of the jokes, the classroom, because I just would have too much, fall asleep in the
oh,
classroom,
really? Oh, wow.
things like that. Yeah. Sometimes as well, when socially, if I'm overstimulated or there's too much going on, I'll just take myself off, disappear, go
Okay.
and fall asleep.
Yeah,
So that's
okay.
happened at quite a few events,
Right.
gatherings, parties, stuff like that. I'll just leave, just go to bed.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it can just be so
Well,
overwhelming and
well,
exhausting.
I want to continue with that because you've touched on some of it there. So we spoke about some of the mental health issues. Like, what are some of the other difficulties with ADHD? And we've mentioned kind of school, work, and socially. We spoke a good bit about school, I suppose. And you've just continue on a little bit there on socially. You were saying like at gatherings. Is there anything else that people with ADHD might
Yes.
struggle with socially?
Yeah, there is something called RSD, which is rejection sensitive dysphoria.
Okay.
And it's a condition that's linked to ADHD, where the person can experience severe emotional pain because of a failure or
Yeah.
feeling rejected or
Okay.
perceived rejection.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's due to differences in brain structure, which means your brain can't regulate rejection related emotions and behaviors, and it makes them just much more intense. So
Okay.
it's really common for people with ADHD to feel emotions more intensely.
Okay.
And that can make it very difficult in relationships.
So would that
So
mean
there's,
like having say an emotional reaction to a stimulus of some description that would be maybe out of proportion to what you might expect?
yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So having a major meltdown. And I remember one thing that the feedback my parents would receive about me growing up was typically she's overly sensitive.
Mm,
Um, so I would have big reactions to, quite small things. Over the years, I learned to manage that with emotional regulation
yes.
tools.
Yeah.
But I would maybe find something might really trigger me and I'd go off on one. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember once I was in a part-time job, and this was in my early 20s, and there was one of those like drink machines, and I put in money and it wouldn't give me out the drink,
Right.
and I kind of kicked the machine
Okay.
a little bit to see if I could get it out, and my manager at the time passed by and he gave out to me in front of a group of people because I'd like kicked the machine. Now, I
Yeah.
didn't do it viciously or anything. Oh, I remember like almost wanting to take a vendetta out against him.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
And that's
was so mortified and so angry with him. I felt, oh, he showed me up in front of people, and
yeah.
my reaction was way over the top.
And is that linked a little bit to what you said earlier, the rejection sensitive dysphoria, that you would have taken that particularly hard
Oh,
to
yeah,
heart?
right to
Yeah.
heart. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Or not getting invited to things.
Okay.
And that may have been an oversight on a person's behalf, but
Yeah.
I would brood about it and go into the
Okay.
obsessive thinking, things like that. So that could be really
Yeah.
hard for friendships and relationships.
Okay. And what about,
Mm.
so I mean that sounds quite difficult. Would I be right in saying as well, so some people with ADHD would tend to be talkative, and some would say maybe overly so, and that can cause difficulty socially?
Yes, there can be a tendency for people to disrupt conversations
Mm,
or blurt things out. And
yeah.
that can be that because you're afraid you'll forget it.
Yeah.
So you have this intense need to say your piece while somebody might be in the middle of their own conversation.
Okay.
I've
Okay.
found I've had to pull myself in a lot about, over that, but it was something I didn't realize I
Yeah.
was doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I can tend to do that with people that I don't know very well.
Mhm.
Um, I just kind of rabbit on and not
Yeah.
take in the
Yes,
conversation.
yes. And also when we mentioned earlier about sometimes getting fixated on a particular topic, and another trait I've seen with some people who've spoken to me who have ADHD, that when I get going on a subject I'm interested in, I'm like a spinning top. There's kind of no stopping me, and that can
No
cause issues.
stopping. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
And they
And the
often said
obsessive
afterwards they'd feel a
increases.
bit guilty and said, "Oh God, why didn't I, not talk about that so much? What impression have I
Yes.
made there?" And that's very difficult socially.
Mm.
Um,
And it's in educating yourself about those things that you develop the awareness and the insight so you can manage that. And knowing that it's just a trait of ADHD, but it's not a flaw in your
yeah,
character, not
yeah,
rude or not that you don't listen to people.
mm,
So it's just training yourself.
yeah,
But
and
then also they can be very in tune
yes,
to people as well. So
yeah,
quite sensitive to other people's
yeah.
emotions and moods as
And we're
well.
we're going to come back to that kind of at the end as well. And just so we kind of spoke about school socially, and you kind of again touched on this, difficulties that would it cause difficulties at work, in a work environment?
Yes, people can find it difficult to be a team player or work as part of a team. They can maybe prefer just to work on their own or in a quieter space.
Hmm.
Again, it's not that they're rude or they want, certain privileges of having their own office, but the distractions can be too much. I would not be able to work in an open planned office. I'd
Mm,
get nothing done.
yeah,
There,
yeah.
there are things that can help, such as noise cancelling, earphones, music can really help
Okay.
with focus as well. Or I know in schools now they will allow kids to have those breaks where they can move because
Yes.
movement is really important.
Hmm. Hmm.
Or they'll have those kind of swivel chairs because movement again can
Yes.
really help with regulating.
Okay.
Or those fidget toys.
Yes, because that's
Yeah.
an expression I've heard. Stimming, is that right? Could you explain
Yes,
that to me?
stimming. So that can be what you might see is the person rocking back and forth a lot.
Hmm. Hmm.
Or another thing is that they can be picking at their skin or their hair.
Mm, okay.
That's a form of stimming. I know I'll do that with my hair. I'll pull
Yeah,
at my
yeah,
hair quite a lot, or just pulling, kind of picking
yeah,
at my scalp.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
all
yeah,
sounds
yeah,
awful,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah. I
that's
know.
like a stimming behavior.
Hmm.
My own son, his probably was more obvious. He would flap quite a bit, which is
Okay.
something that people with autism can typically do.
Hmm.
So he'd often pace
Okay.
back and forth with this flapping motion.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
helped regulate him. He would do it if he was excited
Right,
sometimes as
right.
well.
Okay.
As a baby, when certain programs come on the TV, he loved Teletubbies at the time.
Okay.
He would
Yeah, yeah.
start all this flapping, but he learned then to, I suppose, do it in a space where it was more private.
Mm.
That because again, that kind of overt behavior, it can cause people to be bullied or made fun of.
Yes.
So he learned kind of where and when to do those behaviors. As I said, the pacing or you, you know, tapping the foot a lot,
Yes, yes.
that kind of thing. They would be characters of stimming.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's interesting. And like, and work. Another thing you mentioned earlier is maybe people having a difficulty kind of maybe staying seated in a situation where you'd probably be expected to stay seated in an office or something like that. And that's
Yes.
another kind of thing that can cause difficulties.
Yeah. So a person may need regular breaks where they can get up and walk around and have that bit of movement there as well. So exercise is also really important in supporting people with ADHD symptoms.
And would the likes of things like meeting deadlines and things like that could obviously, you mentioned that in other circumstances earlier. I'd imagine in a work environment that could be quite difficult. With
Yes.
that type of thing.
It can really leave the person feeling overwhelmed. So learning how to break tasks down into smaller steps and following a particular system can really help. And just by implementing various structures and routines, take advantage of tools to support you in that, like planners, reminders, set yourself up to maintain organization and really control all that clutter around. That helps. So having a minimalistic
Yeah,
lifestyle or environment is
yeah.
really good for controlling the anxiety.
Okay.
One thing for me, I feel extremely overwhelmed if the house is messy or disorganized.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's something that will really set me off.
And sometimes
Um,
is it the kind of the scale of the task ahead can be quite
yeah,
intimidating, can't it?
the
It's
scale
it's
of
the,
the
it's
task.
merely the thought of it rather, which can make it very hard to just get a start.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's important, as I said, just to break it down into small, manageable
Mm,
tasks,
mm.
because then with the overwhelm, that paralysis can sit in or set in. I know I'm in the paralysis when I'm just sitting there on the phone, scrolling endlessly at stupid
Mhm.
TikTok videos or
Yeah, yeah,
YouTube,
yeah.
knowing I've got a load of stuff to do and I just can't seem to get it done.
And those
And
those are
that's,
some traits that a lot of people, even people without ADHD, would, especially
yeah.
these days in the era of the smartphone. I think we've all found ourselves. I certainly have. I know I should be doing something else, but oh, look what's on Instagram. Uh,
Mm.
you
And
know,
the TikTok stuff or those reels on Facebook,
yes,
they are like little pockets, little dopamine hits for
yes, yeah,
people with
yeah,
ADHD.
yeah.
And often, well, people with ADHD and autism can often have a lot of difficulties with gaming online stuff because
Okay,
they're getting that immediate hit of dopamine.
right.
I can just get trapped in the TikTok cycle for hours,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
looking at
yeah.
it
Once you
like
get
endlessly
started,
because
yeah, yeah.
and it's
I,
perfect. These little tiny videos, I'm not gonna get bored
yeah,
with
and
them.
they're short. They give you that quick hit.
Short,
It doesn't
quick hit, yeah.
require sustained concentration. It's kind of
Mm.
there, 20 seconds onto the next one. Yeah, and I think, like I said, that's something I think a lot of us can identify with. It's probably something that goes beyond ADHD, and I think as a society we probably have to look at our phone usage. And only the other day I installed an app that basically minimizes my phone interface. It removes all the icons,
Oh,
all gone, and all I have now is a list of some of the apps in written in letters, very, very simple. And I found I've been scrolling a bit less because it's just a little bit less attractive to me now. I found it. Yeah, we might mention that in the comments there. Yeah, I found that really interesting. Suddenly, without those visual kind of logos inviting me to tap on Instagram or whatever, they're not there anymore. I kind of have to go looking for it in a list. I found that kind of, again,
Oh, that's a good idea.
you mentioned
Yeah.
minimizing, and there was a real minimalist kind of approach to the phone, and I found it. I've only been using it a few days, and I
Oh,
found
that's
it
a
really
great tip,
good.
Barry. So,
Yeah,
yeah, maybe you might put in that link
yeah, yeah.
to that app, or what it's cost.
I'll show it
Or,
to you when we're off camera there afterwards. But I found it. Yeah, we'll put a link into that. Really, really interesting. And I would say I'll be interested to see, because my phone usually gives me stats at the end of the week, of your
ah,
usage of different things. So I'll be interested to see, without really any effort, have they gone down naturally with that. And the other thing is, you can use this app to set limits on different apps. So you might say Instagram, 30 minutes a day. And once it hits 30 minutes, it'll tell you, knock it off. It's time to stop.
oh,
It'll
yes.
give you a little reminder. So yeah, that's just one of the little, technology can be, smartphones, they can be brilliant, but they can be also, they can
Oh, so
drain our
tempting.
time, can't
Yeah,
they?
yeah, they can. And also the impulsivity and the disorganization that can accompany
Yeah.
ADHD. You may struggle with erratic sleep, and
Yes.
the phone, being on the phones all night, that doesn't help.
No.
Um, Unhealthy diet as well, because
Hmm.
again, looking for the dopamine, the sugar hits, that kind of
Yes.
thing.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Or the effects of too little exercise. They're all issues that can lead to extra stress,
Yeah.
bad moods, and just that feeling of just feeling out of control.
Yeah.
So what I would say, Barry, is that the best way to stop this cycle is
Okay.
to take charge of your lifestyle
Right.
and just create as many healthy routines as you can, and
Okay.
ones that you can keep, not the fatty ones like
Yes.
the one I had a couple of weeks ago, where I was making my own, body scrubs and face
Yeah.
creams and all of
Right.
that until I got bored with that. But
Yeah.
just keep something that you can sustain,
And even
something. Yeah.
maybe, I mean, one change a week. I mean, that builds
Yes,
up instead of trying to do
one
everything at
change a week.
once.
Absolutely. And things like even remembering to drink plenty of water,
Yeah.
things like that. So having, maybe try and aim for like 2 liters of water a day if you can. So
Mm.
that can really help with we can tend to forget to drink water, and then we become dehydrated.
Mm.
That affects our focus.
Mm.
Also, we can then feel hungry when we're actually thirsty.
Yes. Yes. Definitely. I mean,
So
there's some great
yeah,
tips. And any other tips you'd recommend for people with ADHD?
eating well,
Right.
just getting, as I said, your sleep, exercising, and you exercise, it really helps with those symptoms,
Mm.
and it can reduce the symptoms of inattention, the hyperactivity,
Okay.
distractibility. So those regular routines will really help you feel that life is more manageable. But
Right.
exercise, it's the most positive and efficient way to reduce the hyperactivity and
Okay.
inattention from
Right.
ADHD.
That's
So
interesting.
get yourself involved in some kind of a sport, get the kids involved in
Hmm.
something where they're actually burning off all
Yes.
that energy. And exercise, in turn, it relieves stress, it boosts your mood,
Yeah.
it can calm your mind. And as I said, it helps work off that excess energy
Hmm.
and the aggression that can build up and
Okay.
gets in the way of relationships and
Right.
friendships.
Right. And I mean, it's
Mhm.
interesting because a lot of the tips you've given there are things that we should probably all be following. And I mean, and we
Yes.
in our first, I think, or the second podcast we ever recorded, we went through some of the kind of general tips for mental health, and a lot of that was in it. I suppose some of it would be maybe an extra challenge for somebody with ADHD, but the kind of the basic tips are very similar to what we should all be doing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. The next thing I want to ask you about, if what would you say to somebody who And this is something you came to, you said, like kind of later in adult life, who suspects that they might have ADHD. I mean, either as a parent with a child or particularly an adult thinking, I have a lot of those traits. I wonder. What would you
Yes,
say to anyone like that? Start with the parents maybe first.
parents, yeah. So if you're getting, let's say, feedback from your child's teacher that they are having a lot of difficulty with focus, with concentration, organizational skills, they'll really begin to notice that. And hopefully teachers are getting enough training at the moment where they can look out for some of those indicators. They may mention it to the parent, or
Right.
if there is an educational psychologist at your child's school, or if the school can recommend, that's always really helpful. But your first port of call should always be your doctor,
Okay.
who again then can refer you to the specialists. But ADHD Ireland, they've got a lot of information on their website.
Okay.
We'll leave the link in
Yeah,
for after the
definitely.
show, where people can find out. But typically, if you decide to go down the medication route, you will also have to be seen by a psychiatrist,
Hmm.
because they can only prescribe ADHD medication, because it is highly regulated
Yes.
medication.
Yeah.
As an adult, you may have always felt something was amiss. You might have gone to the doctor with anxiety, depression, those kind of things, but still felt that there was just something off,
Mm.
which is what I felt. I felt there was something different, but I didn't know what it was. I had symptoms of anxiety and depression growing up as well.
Mm-hmm.
And those symptoms were exacerbated pre-menstrual, so
Yeah.
that those
Yeah.
kind of two
Yeah.
weeks, because of the hormone flux,
Yes. Yes.
the up and downs in the hormones. And also, when I had my children, I had postnatal depression,
Right.
again because of the hormone imbalance. Again, that's not saying women with bad PMT or postnatal depression would have ADHD. However, they were some of the indicators that went unseen for me.
Yes. Yeah.
Eventually, I did find a doctor who diagnosed me with premenstrual dysmorphia,
Right.
which we now know a lot of women with ADHD have
Okay.
premenstrual dysmorphia, which is a more intense form of premenstrual tension. But I couldn't make the link at the time. So I was being treated for symptoms of depression and anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
and being prescribed antidepressants for those, for the PMDD symptoms.
Mm.
So typically for 2 weeks before I got my period, I just, was not in a good place at all.
Right.
But thank goodness there's a lot more research being done on that, and a lot more support for women.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And as I said, particularly women, because and especially I'd say adult women. You don't hear of so
Yes,
many adult women being diagnosed with ADHD. It's and no doubt there are many out there who are probably undiagnosed.
yes, and all those things, flew under the radar, and they may have had, suffered silently because there was a lot of stigma around it, and there's so much pressure on women to, be parents, be a professional in the
Yes.
workplace,
Yes.
to keep on top of things in the house, and they can feel like they're constantly failing, and that sense of overwhelm, which really becomes more and more difficult when children come along, because
Mm.
trying to manage
Yeah.
kids, trying to manage a home, and maybe trying to manage a job as well, it really can become overwhelming for a lot of women.
Yeah.
And again, because of the masking, it would go
Mm.
undiagnosed.
And just
So on
a
the
little bit,
outside,
what would an example of masking be? You mentioned a little bit about already how people would hide it.
yeah. So they would often people please, so
Okay.
trying to fit in a lot with others, and also having difficulty saying no,
Mm.
things like that, because they don't want people to not like them.
Yeah,
They
that's that
essentially
rejection you
already,
spoke about earlier. Yeah.
yes, they might not like themselves
Mm.
for these things that they feel are not good about them. And being told maybe that they're lazy or hypersensitive, moody, things like that. But there
Yeah.
was a genuine cause for those things. So the masking can be, again, just people pleasing,
Hmm.
pretending everything is okay,
Yeah.
mimicking others. So
Mm.
trying to fit in with peers.
Yes.
So kind of taking on other people's behaviors because they feel, oh, maybe they're the personality traits and behaviors of a person that's normal or who fits in. And this is really difficult, especially for teens when trying to find their identity, trying to
Yes.
find out who they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they may kind of, go with the cool group who
Hmm.
might not be the best group for them to go
Mm.
along with.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, and that's a bit of a jungle already. That whole kind of, teenage years and peer groups, and it's tough
Yeah.
anyway, never mind if you've ADHD. And I just, before I move on to the last bit, I mean, I suppose we have this image of the ADHD child, hyperactive, not attentive in class. It's not always that way, is it? Especially when it comes to masking.
Yeah. And these children can be extremely bright and talented in different areas. So they may, as we go back to the hyper focusing.
Mm.
So if they have an interest in a particular subject at school, they will excel in it. But if they
Okay.
don't have an interest, then that's
Yeah.
it. They, you can find they won't pay any attention to the subject at all. As a kid, I loved art
Right.
and English. So they were things I really enjoyed and was always present in those
Mm.
classes.
Mm.
But maths, things that I found difficult, Irish,
Yeah.
I had no time for it at all. No,
Yeah.
that was nothing could get me to focus on them. I didn't like them, and that was it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Okay, so the last, I want to kind of finish on a positive here, because we mentioned that the conditions like ADHD, they're often portrayed in a negative light. It's something to be overcome. It's something to, you have to learn to live with. But we mentioned a little bit of this already. That there are some positives
There certainly are.
associated with having ADHD. Let's talk about them for a moment.
So people with ADHD can typically be really highly creative people. So
Mm,
there's a lot of people in the arts,
okay,
in the world of film and music who have ADHD. There can be a lot of spontaneity as well, Barry, and
right.
I don't know whether that's a good thing
Yeah,
or a
well, I'm
bad
sure
thing
in
at
certain
times.
circumstances it probably is, and I've heard a lot of people with
Yeah.
ADHD are very good at thinking outside the box and coming up with creative
Yes,
solutions and that type of thing.
very much so. And that's why a lot of organizations like to, have a big interest in people with ADHD as well.
Mm,
They come up with the ideas, the creativity in the company. As you said, look at things from a different angle,
yeah,
problem solve from a different way. Again, the hyper focus can be really good. So there can be a lot of attention to detail, things that somebody else might not notice, person with ADHD will notice.
okay,
Again, people can tend to be quite empathic.
yes.
People with
Tell me about
ADHD,
that.
there's that sensitivity to others, and again, that can be sometimes because of their own experiences
Hmm.
and haven't felt different from a
Yeah,
very young age. So they can be more in tune to other people's emotions. And that can stem also from hypervigilance.
okay,
So being aware of what people are thinking, overly aware.
Yes.
And that can be from a protection aspect as well.
Yeah.
Because they can be ridiculed for constantly being late or not picking up things on the first go, things like that. So there's that overcompensation at times, which can be also good as well.
Okay. And I'll finish up with something I read there recently, an article about ADHD, and the person writing it described it as my superpower. And I thought that was a great way
Yes,
to put it.
it is. It's a lovely way to put it. And that's what we're focusing more on now. Everybody's different.
Yeah.
We don't all learn the same way.
Yeah.
And my way of organizing things may be totally different to other people's, but
Yes.
it's my way. And that doesn't mean that it's bad or wrong. It's just different. And that's why I like that word as well, neurodivergent.
Yeah.
Because it just takes into account, and it's a nice, gentle way of describing.
It is. And we have a centre in the same building as the library called Not So Different. And it's for
Oh, lovely.
neurodivergent people, and they do fantastic work for young people. So that's a resource as well people can look into. That is right. You
Yes.
can take your trip into the library and then head up to Not So Different, all in the same building. And I'll just say as well before we finish up, like we do have some very good facilities in the library now for neurodivergent people. We now run quiet evenings. We have sensory toys. We have a fabulous two fabulous Topher Tapple tables. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. They're often known
Oh,
as a
no.
magic table, and it's a projector, a type of projector that projects onto a table or any kind of a surface, and it has all these sensory games that you can play. And the Europe Direct has actually sponsored a brand new one for the library, so we've two now, and they're welcome to
Fantastic.
anyone to use, but they're of particular use to people with ADHD, autism, and we've even had some people who may have dementia who have found them very useful as well.
And the executive functioning is
Exactly.
impaired with people with dementia.
That's it. And we have a sensory pod as well, which is very popular, where somebody can go inside, it dampens the noise, the soft lights, and there you go in with a parent or a guardian, you can read a story. It kind of cuts out most of the distractions, and it's really nice. I'm really tempted by it. I'd love to go in there for my breaks, to be honest with you. But it's really, really popular with people. So we have some great facilities. We've reading material, as I said, we've sensory toys. And we have our quiet evenings. So look out for all that stuff.
Yeah,
We're
and it's great, Barry, that there's so many resources and free resources as well.
yeah,
But what I would say again to any parent or any adult who has suspicions about themselves or their child, have a chat with your doctor,
yeah.
or come in and talk to that group who are near the library. What
Yeah.
are
We
they
have
called again?
Not So Different. Yeah.
Not so different. You see,
And
there's my lack
they're
of focus,
there
Barry.
you are. They're fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. And also the ADHD Ireland website has
Yes.
lots of information as well. And just look it up. And something I've heard, I've heard things like saying, oh, everybody has ADHD
Yes, I've
nowadays.
heard
And
that a
they
bit. Yeah.
don't.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite disrespectful to
Yes.
say to people. And no, not everybody does have it. Um, and it's about really going to the right professionals
Yes.
to get
And I
your
think what
diagnosis.
maybe people are confusing there is everybody probably has some of the traits associated with it.
Yes,
I
exactly.
mean, a lot of the
It's
stuff you've described today,
traits.
we've all done. It's when a lot of them come together. I think
It
that's
is.
when you
And
might think,
there's the three areas that we looked
yes,
at. And in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Conditions, they look for 6 indicators in each of those 3 areas.
okay,
But the
yes.
screening and assessment, it can be a lengthy, expensive
Mm.
process.
And I know that they
And
even sometimes
yeah,
bring in somebody who's close to the person,
Yes, they
partner or
do.
something to kind of, in a
Hmm.
way, double verify all of this.
Yes,
Because they
they
as well, other
do.
people may notice things you don't notice as well,
Yeah.
which is another kind of element of it.
And I
Um,
think as an adult, you can feel a sense, sometimes a little bit of loss, of grief
mm,
that, oh, now I know what was, in inverted commas, wrong with
yeah,
me.
yeah, I know what you mean.
And I didn't receive the help or the support.
Yeah,
And for me, back, like I'm, you know, 52, Barry. So
yeah,
back when I was in school, we didn't know anything about it.
yeah,
So there weren't the supports, and I was kept back in school, which had an awful effect on my self-esteem because I felt like the stupid kid or the slow
yeah,
kid.
yeah, yeah.
And it wasn't my fault at all, nor my parents. We just
No,
didn't know. There
you
wasn't
didn't
enough
know. Yeah,
research at
people
the
didn't
time.
know what this was about. Yeah.
Yeah. So as an adult, I certainly felt a sense of loss and grief
Hmm.
getting the diagnosis. Well, what could have been,
Mm,
what I could have achieved.
yes.
However, it also explained a lot to me,
Was there a
which
sense of
gave me,
relief in any way?
oh yeah, a tremendous sense of relief, Barry,
Mm.
that I know that it wasn't me being weird or
Yeah,
abnormal
yeah,
in any
yeah.
way. These were traits that I was exhibiting and behaviors I held because of how my brain functions.
Yeah.
Um, I decided to go down the medical route, and I'm
Okay.
medicated at the moment
Yes.
for the
Yeah.
ADHD.
And
And
can I
I
just,
take,
you mentioned the
mhm,
medication, and can just, before we finish, one last thing. Medication is one route you can take, and you can
yes,
also get some counseling as well. Is that another kind of thing you
yes,
can, or combine it?
combined, yeah, definitely a combination of supports is the best. Just going at it from a multifaceted uh, way and multifaceted approach. So, there's lots of different things. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which can help people to control behaviors and learn new adaptive behaviors, or therapies that will focus more on emotional regulation. But education, training, do whatever you can do.
Mm.
Um, that can maybe become your hyper focus.
Yes. Yes.
But it helps. But also having an understanding and patience with yourself,
Yeah. That's so
just
important, isn't it?
having that positive, unconditional positive regard for yourself.
Yeah.
That even though it may have been really tough,
Hmm.
being in the education system of the 70s and 80s in
Hmm.
Ireland was
Hmm.
no doubt tough for people with ADHD.
Yeah.
You've made it. You've made it this far.
Yeah.
Um, and just to be gentle and supportive to yourself,
Yeah.
as you would to any friend or child. And for me, taking medication was a game changer, a
Really.
complete game
Okay.
changer.
Okay.
And I decided to take stimulant medication along with psychotherapy.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I would sometimes engage with my own psychotherapist,
Yeah.
and particularly when I'm feeling maybe that emotions are too much
Uh,
or I've got a lot of
Can I
stressors.
just ask you something on this? And we've already done a session on the therapeutic process. Is it strange for you as a psychotherapist to go into another psychotherapist? And do you ever find yourself? They often say like the hardest people to treat are doctors because they'll you want to diagnose themselves and they'll want to, do you find that tough?
I sometimes feel a little bit self-conscious, or there may be that initial feeling of, oh, that person can see through me now.
Yeah.
Um, that kind of feeling judged, or,
Yes.
I shouldn't have problems because
Yeah.
I'm meant to have it all worked out.
Yeah.
But you know what? I'm just a human being like everybody else.
Yeah.
Maybe I have a little bit more awareness of when things are going bad, and
Yeah.
that I need to get myself into some support.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think that will be a lifelong process, Barry,
Of
because
course.
I'll forever be evolving and going through
Mm.
changes in my own life. and inevitably they will bring their own challenges.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's
and again,
an important part of my healthcare.
Yeah, and that goes for all of us, as I said, as well. You know, we all evolve and change and have different challenges and obstacles throughout our life, and there's nothing wrong with reaching out for some help. And please, anyone listening here, do. There's lots of supports out there, and we've actually in the other podcast we've spoken about them. So in particular, the ones where we spoke about tips for mental health and also the therapeutic process. So I'd advise you to listen to them as well. We'll put the links underneath. And I think that's a good place to finish up. So thank you, Amber. That was really enlightening. I've certainly learned a huge amount there. I have a better understanding now. I think I'd really misunderstood what ADHD was, and now I'm a lot clearer on what it actually is. And
I'm glad to hear that, Barry, and hopefully it will help some of our listeners out there.
Without a
Okay,
doubt.
and thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you so much, Amber.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.